Some of the German prisoners were carrying out Russian corpses from the cellar of a 2-story building that had once been the headquarters of the Gestapo. In spite of the cold, a group of women, boys and old men were standing beside the sentry and watching the Germans lay out the corpses on the frozen earth. Most of the prisoners wore an expression of complete indifference. They dragged their feet as they walked and breathed in the smell of death without flinching. There was just one, a young man in an officer's greatcoat, who had tied a handkerchief around his mouth and nose, and was shaking his head convulsively like a horse stung by gadflies. The expression of torment in his eyes seemed close to madness. Sometimes the prisoners put a stretcher down on the ground and stood over it for a while. Some of the corpses were missing an arm or leg, and the prisoners were wondering which of the spare limbs belonged to which corpse. Most of the corpses were half naked or in their underclothes. A few were wearing trousers. One was quite naked. His mouth was wide open in a last cry. His stomach had sunk right into his backbone. He had reddish pubic hair and pitifully thin legs. It was impossible to imagine that these corpses, with their sunken mouths and eye sockets, had until not long ago been living beings with names and homes, that they'd smoked cigarettes, longed for a mug of beer, and said, "My darling, my beautiful, give me a kiss and don't forget me." The officer with a handkerchief round his mouth seemed to be the only person able to imagine all this. But for some reason he was the one who appeared to attract the anger of the women standing beside the entrance. They kept their eyes fixed on him and ignored the remaining prisoners, despite the fact that 2 of them had light patches over their overcoats where their SS insignia had once been. "So you're trying to look away, are you?" muttered a squat woman who was holding a little boy by his hand. The officer could sense the weight of emotion in the woman's slow, penetrating look. The air was full of a hatred that needed to be discharged. It was like the electrical energy in a storm cloud that strikes blindly and with consuming power at one of the trees in a forest. The officer's fellow worker was a short soldier with a thin towel round his neck and some sacking tied with telephone cable round his legs. The Russians standing in silence by the door looked so hostile that the prisoners felt relieved to go back down again into the dark cellar. They stayed there as long as they could, preferring the stench and darkness to the fresh air and daylight. The prisoners were on their way back to the cellar with empty stretchers when they heard the familiar sound of Russian swear words. They carried on at the same pace, sensing instinctively that one sudden movement would be enough to make the crowd turn on them. The officer suddenly let out a cry, and the guard said irritably, "Hey, you brat! What's the use of throwing stones? You going to take over if the Fritz comes a cropper?" Back down in the cellar, the prisoner had a few words together. "For the time being, they've only got it in for the lieutenant. Did you see the way that woman looked at him?" "You stay in the cellar this time, Lieutenant," said a voice out of the darkness. "If they start on you, then we'll be next." No, it's no good hiding," the officer murmured sleepily. "This is the day of judgment." He turned to his fellow worker. "Come on now, let's be off." This time their burden was lighter, and they walked faster than usual as they came out of the cellar. On the stretcher lay the corpse of an adolescent girl. Her body was shriveled and dried up. Only her blonde hair still kept its warm life and colour, falling in disorder round the terrible blackened face of a dead bird. The crowd gave a quiet gasp. The squat woman let out a shrill cry. Her voice cut through the cold air like a blade. "My child! My child! My golden child!" The crowd was shaken by the way the woman had cried out for a child who wasn't even her own. The woman began tidying the girl's hair. It looked as if it had only recently been curled. She gazed at her face, at her forever twisted mouth, at her terrible features. In them she could see what only a mother could have seen, the adorable face of the baby who had once smiled at her out of its swaddling clothes. The woman got to her feet and strode towards the officer. Everyone was struck by the way she kept her eyes fixed on him, and yet at the same time managed to find a brick that wasn't part of a great frozen heap, a brick that even her poor hand could pick up, her poor weak hand that had been deformed by years of labour, that had been scalded by boiling water, icy water, and lye. The guard sensed what was about to happen, and knew there was nothing he could do to stop the woman. She was stronger than his Tommy gun. The prisoners could take their eyes off her, but the children watched her avidly and impatiently. The woman could no longer see anything at all except the face of the German with the handkerchief round his mouth. Not understanding what was happening to her, governed by a power she had just now seemed to control, she felt in the pocket of her jacket a piece of bread that had been given to her the evening before by a soldier. She held it out to the German officer and said, "There, have something to eat." Afterwards she was unable to understand what had happened to her, why she had done this. Her life was to be full of moments of humiliation, helplessness and anger, full of petty cruelties that made her lie awake at night, full of brooding resentment. There was the time she quarrelled with her neighbour who had accused her of stealing a bottle of oil. The time the chairman of the district soviet, not interested in her complaints about life in a communal flat, had her thrown out of his office. The time when her son began manoeuvring to get her out of the room they shared, when his pregnant wife called her an old whore. At one such moment, lying on her bed full of bitterness, she was to remember that winter morning outside the cellar and think, "I was a fool then, and I'm still a fool now." Alarming reports were reaching Novikov's headquarters from his brigade commanders. Their scouts had located German tank and artillery units that hadn't yet taken part in the fighting. The enemy was evidently bringing up his reserves. Novikov found this information very disturbing. His forward units were advancing without securing their flanks. If the enemy should succeed in cutting the small number of passable roads, his tanks would be left with no infantry support and no fuel. Novikov discussed the situation with Getmanov. He considered it essential to call a temporary halt to the tank's advance and allow the forces in the rear to catch up. Getmanov was still obsessed by the idea that their corps must be the first to enter the Ukraine. In the end, they agreed that Getmanov should bring up the rear, while Novikov investigated the situation to the west. Before setting off for the brigades, Novikov phoned Yeremenko's second-in-command and informed him of the situation. He knew in advance what answer he had received. The second-in-command would never take the responsibility either to call a halt to their advance or of ordering them to continue. The second-in-command would say that he would alert Yeremenko and that he would request information from the intelligence service at Front HQ. Novikov then phoned Molokov, the commander of the infantry corps next door. Molokov was a difficult, bad-tempered man who constantly suspected his neighbours of making unfavourable reports about him to Yeremenko. He and Novikov ended up arguing and even exchanging curses, not admittedly directed at each other, but at the widening gap opening up between the tanks and the infantry. After that, Novikov phoned his neighbour on the left, the commander of an artillery division. He said he didn't intend to advance any further unless he received orders from front headquarters. Novikov could understand his point of view. He didn't want merely to play a supporting role to the tanks. As Novikov was hanging up, Neodobnov came in. Novikov had never seen him looking so flustered and anxious. "Comrade Colonel," he said, "I've just had a call from the Chief of Staff of the Air Army. They're about to transfer our support aircraft to the left flank." "What do you mean?" shouted Novikov. "They must be out of their minds." "There's no mystery about it," said Neodobnov. "Some people would prefer us not to be the first to enter the Ukraine. There are more than enough men who've got their eyes on the orders of Suvorov and Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Without air support, we've no choice but to call a halt." "I'll phone Yeremenko straight away." Yeremenko, however, had left for Tolbukin's army. His second-in-command, whom Novikov had only just phoned, again preferred not to take any decision. He merely expressed surprise that Novikov hadn't yet moved up to his brigades. "Comrade Lieutenant General," said Novikov, "I fail to understand how you can possibly, without warning, remove all air cover from the corps that has advanced furthest towards the west." "Your superiors are better placed than you to decide how best to make use of the support aircraft," came the angry reply. "Yours isn't the only corps taking part in this offensive." "What am I going to say to my soldiers when the Germans start pounding them?" demanded Novikov. "How am I going to cover them? With your instructions?" Instead of losing his temper, the second-in-command adopted a conciliatory tone. "I'll report the situation to the commander. You set off for your brigades." Then Getmanov came in. He had already put on his cap and overcoat. When he saw Novikov, he threw up his hands in astonishment. "Pyotr Pavlovitch, I thought you'd already left." His next words were more gentle. "You say the rear's lagging behind. Well, the officer responsible says we shouldn't be wasting trucks and precious petrol on wounded Germans." He gave Novikov a meaningful look. "After all, we're not a section of the Comintern, we're a fighting unit." "What on earth's Comintern got to do with it?" "Comrade Colonel," said Neudobnov entreatingly, "it's time you left. Every moment's precious. I'll do everything in my power to sort things out with headquarters." Since his conversation with Derensky, Novikov had been watching Neudobnov constantly, following his every movement. "Not with that very hand? I can't believe it," he'd think to himself as Neudobnov took hold of a spoon, speared a piece of pickled cucumber on a fork, or picked up the telephone. Now, though, Novikov had forgotten all about that. He'd never seen Neudobnov so friendly, so concerned, so likeable even. Getmanov and Neudobnov were ready to sell their souls to the devil if only they could be the first to enter the Ukraine, if only the brigades could continue their advance without delay. But there was one risk they wouldn't run, that of taking responsibility themselves for an action that might lead to a setback. In spite of himself, Novikov had succumbed to this fever. He too wanted to be able to radio to HQ that his advance units had been the first to cross the frontier. In military terms, this meant very little, and certainly would not occasion the enemy any particular harm, but Novikov wanted it nonetheless, for the glory of it, for the order of Suvorov, for the rank of general it would certainly assure him. He wanted to be thanked by Yeremenko, to be praised by Vasylevsky, to hear his name over the radio on Stalin's order of the day. He even wanted his neighbours to be jealous of him. Such thoughts and feelings had never governed his acts before. It was perhaps for this very reason that they were now so intense. There was nothing reprehensible in this ambition of his. Everything was the same as in Stalingrad and during 1941. The cold was just as pitiless. The soldiers were still half dead with exhaustion. Death was still as terrifying. And yet the whole spirit of the war was changing. And Novikov, who hadn't yet understood this, was surprised to find himself in agreement for once with Getmanov and Neudobnov. He no longer felt irritated or resentful. He seemed quite naturally to want the same things as they did. If his tanks advanced faster, the invaders would indeed be driven out of a few Ukrainian villages a few hours sooner. It would make him happy to see the joy on the faces of the children and old men. Some old peasant woman would fling her arms around him as though he were her own son. His eyes would fill with tears. But at the same time, new passions were ripening. The spirit of the war was changing. What had been crucial in Stalingrad and during 1941 was coming to be of merely secondary importance. The first person to understand this change was the man who, on the 3rd of June 1941, had said, "My brothers and sisters, my friends." Getmanov and Neudobnov were egging Novikov on. He shared their excitement, but for some strange reason kept putting off his departure. It was only as he got into his jeep that he realized it was because he was expecting Xenia. It was over 3 weeks since he had heard from her. Each time he had made his way back to HQ, he hoped to find Xenia waiting for him on the steps. She had come to share in his life. She was with him when he talked to his brigade commanders, when he was called to the telephone by front headquarters, when he drove up to the front line and felt his tank trembling at the shell bursts like a young horse. Once, telling Getmanoff the story of his childhood, he had felt as though he were telling it to her. He'd say to himself, "God, I really stink of vodka. Xenia would notice it in no time." Or, "Now, if only she could see that." He had wondered anxiously what she would think if she knew that he had sent a major before the military tribunal. Among the clouds of tobacco smoke and the voices of telephonists in an observation post on the front line, among the gunfire and the exploding bombs, he would be thinking of her. Sometimes he felt jealous of her past. Sometimes he dreamed of her. He'd wake up and be unable to get back to sleep. At times he felt sure their love would last forever. At others he was afraid of being left on his own again. As he got into his jeep, he glanced round at the road leading back to the Volga. It was deserted. He suddenly thought angrily that she should have arrived long ago. Perhaps she had fallen ill. Once again he remembered the day in 1939 when he had heard the news of her marriage and almost shot himself. Why did he love her? He had had other women who were just as good. Was it a joy or a kind of sickness to think so obsessively about one person? It was a good thing he hadn't got involved with any of the girls on his staff. Yes, he had a clean slate, though there had been one night 3 weeks ago. Now, what if she stopped on the way and spent the night in that hut? The young woman might start talking to Xenia. She might describe him and say, "Yes, that colonel's a splendid fellow." Oh, what nonsense goes through one's head? What nonsense? Novikov returned to his headquarters at noon on the following day. He was aching all over. In the small of his back, in his neck and spine, after being shaken about on icy, potholed roads that had been ploughed up by the treads of tanks. It was as though the soldiers had infected him with their own exhaustion, with the stupefaction they felt after so many days without sleep. As they drew up, he saw a group of people standing on the porch. There was Yevgenia Nikolaevna, standing beside Getmanoff, watching the approaching jeep. He felt a flame burning into him. He gasped with a mad joy that was close to pain. He was about to leap out of the still-moving jeep when Vershkov, who was sitting behind him, said, "So, the Commissar's taking the air with that doctor of his. We should take a photo of them. That would make his wife happy." Novikov went inside. He took the letter held out to him by Getmanoff, turned it over, recognized Xenia's handwriting, and stuffed it into his pocket. "All right," he said to Getmanoff. "I'll tell you how I see the situation. What about the letter? Don't you love her any longer?" Thank you, that can wait." Dobnov came in and Novikov began. "The only problem is with the men themselves. They're falling asleep in their tanks during combat. They're worn out, the brigade commanders included. Karpov's not too bad, but Byalov fell asleep while he was talking to me. He hasn't stopped for 5 days. The drivers and mechanics are falling asleep on the move. They're too exhausted even to eat." "But Pyotr Pavlovitch," Getmanoff broke in, "how do you see the general situation?" "There's no risk of a counter-offensive in our sector. The Germans have lost their nerve. They're taking to their heels as fast as they can." As he spoke, he could feel the envelope between his fingers. He let it go for a moment and then quickly grasped it again. He was afraid it might escape from his pocket. "Very well," said Getmanoff. "That seems clear enough. Now listen to what I've got to say. The General and I have been right to the top. I spoke to Nikita Sergeyevich himself. He gave his word that we would not lose our air support." "But Khrushchev has no direct military authority," said Novikov. "Yes and no," said Getmanoff. "The General's just received confirmation from Army headquarters. The aircraft are staying with us." "And the roads aren't bad at all," said Dobnov hurriedly. "The forces in the rear will catch up with us in no time. The main thing, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, is that it's your own decision." "Now he's demoting me," thought Novikov. He really must be worried. Yes, gentlemen, said Getmanov, it seems more and more as though we really will be the ones to begin the liberation of Mother Ukraine. I told Nikita Sergeyevich that our men are besieging their officers, that their greatest dream is to be called the Ukrainian Corps. Novikov felt irritated by this falsehood. There's only one thing they're dreaming of, he said, and that's having a few hours' sleep. Do you understand? They've been on the move for 5 days and 5 nights. So it's been decided, has it? Said Getmanov. We're pressing on, right? Novikov half opened the envelope, stuck 2 fingers inside, and felt the letter itself. His whole body ached to look again at the familiar handwriting. What I've decided, said Novikov, is to call a halt for 10 hours. The men need to recover their strength. They need a rest. 10 hours, said Neudobnov. We'll throw away everything if we lose 10 hours. Wait a moment, said Getmanov. Let's just think about it a little. His cheeks, his ears, even his neck were slowly turning red. I already have thought about it, said Novikov, with a slight laugh. Getmanov exploded. Oh, to hell with them all! So what if they haven't had enough sleep? There'll be time enough for them to sleep. And you want to call a halt just because of that? You're dithering, Pyotr Pavlovitch, and I protest. First you delay the beginning of the offensive, now you want to put your men to bed. It's becoming quite a habit. I intend to report this to the military soviet. Do you think you're in charge of a kindergarten? Wait a moment, said Novikov. Wasn't it you who kissed me for not sending in the tanks until I'd knocked out the enemy artillery? You should put that in your report too. You say I kissed you for that? Said Getmanov in astonishment. You must be mad. Let me be quite frank. As a communist, I feel disturbed that you, a man of the purest proletarian origin, should repeatedly allow yourself to be influenced by alien elements. So it's like that, is it? Said Novikov, raising his voice. Very well, then. He got to his feet, threw back his shoulders, and shouted furiously, I'm in command here, and what I say goes. As for you, Comrade Getmanov, for all I care, you can write reports, stories, whole novels about me. You can send them to whoever you please, even Comrade Stalin himself. And he went through into the adjoining room. Novikov put down the letter he had just read and gave a whistle. He used to whistle like that when he was a little boy. He'd stand under his friend's window and whistle to him to come out and play. It was probably a good 30 years since he'd whistled like that. Then he looked out through the window. No, it was still light. In sudden hysterical joy he cried out, Thank you, thank you, thank you for everything. For a moment he thought he was about to fall down dead. He walked up and down the room. He looked again at the letter on his desk. It was like a white, sloughed-off skin that a viper had just crawled out of. He put his hands to his chest and his sides. The viper wasn't there. He must have crawled inside him already. He must be burning his heart with poison. He stood for a moment by the window. The drivers were laughing as they watched Marusia, the telephonist, walk past to the lavatory. The driver of the staff tank was carrying a bucket from the well. Sparrows were busying themselves in the straw beside the entrance to the cowshed. Xenia had once said that sparrows were her favourite bird. And now he was on fire, just like a house. The beams had given way, the ceiling was falling in, cups and plates were crashing to the floor, cupboards were toppling over, books and pillows were tumbling about, flying through the smoke and the sparks like birds. I shall be grateful all my life for everything pure and noble that you have given me. But what can I do? The past is stronger than I am. I can't kill it. I can't forget it. Don't blame me, not because I'm not guilty, but because neither of us know quite what I am guilty of. Forgive me. I'm crying for us both. So she was crying, was she? Novikov felt a sudden fury. The filthy bitch, the snake. He wanted to punch her on the jaw, in the eyes. He wanted to crack that whore's nose of hers with the butt of his revolver. Suddenly, unbearably suddenly, he felt helpless. There was nothing in the whole world that could help him, only Xenia, and she had destroyed him. He looked in the direction she should have been coming from and said, What have you done to me, Zinechka? Can you hear me? Look at me, Zinechka. Look what you've done to me. He stretched out his hands to her. Then he thought, all this is a waste of time. Yes, he'd waited all these years, but now she'd made up her mind. She wasn't a little girl. She had dragged it out for years, but now she'd made up her mind. She'd made up her mind. He must try to understand that. A few minutes later, he was again trying to find refuge in hatred. No, of course you didn't want me when I was an acting major in Nikolsk or Sertisk. But it was another story when I was promoted. You wanted to be the wife of a general. Well, women are all the same. He soon realised what nonsense this was. She had left him for a man who was on his way to a camp to Kolyma. What would she get out of that? Russian Women, a poem by Nekrasov. She doesn't love me, she loves him. No, she doesn't love him, she pities him. It's just that she pities him. Doesn't she have any pity for me? No one in the Lubyanka, no one in the camps, no one in hospital with a missing arm or leg could be more unhappy than I am. Very well, I'll go to a camp myself. Which of us will you choose then? Him? You two are the same breed, but I'm a stranger. That's what you called me, a stranger. Yes, I'll always be a peasant, a miner. Even if I become a marshal, I'll still never be an intellectual. I'll still never be able to make head or tail of all that painting of yours. In a loud, hate-filled voice, he asked, "But why? Why?" He took his pistol out of his back pocket and weighed it in the palm of his hand. "I'm going to shoot myself. And not because I can't live without you, but to torment you with guilt, you whore." He put his pistol back in its place. "Should have forgotten me in a week." No, he was the one who needed to forget. He mustn't look back. He mustn't give her another thought. He went up to the table and began to read the letter again. "My dearest, my poor darling." It wasn't the cruel words that hurt. It was the ones that were full of pity, full of affectionate, humiliating pity. He felt as though he could hardly breathe. He could see her breasts, her shoulders, her knees. There she was, on her way to that wretched Krimov. But what can I do? She was travelling in a crowded, airless wagon. Someone asked her a question and she answered, "To join my husband." She had the sad, docile eyes of a dog, and he had looked out of his very window to see if she was on her way to him. His shoulders shook. He sniffed and gave a kind of bark. He was choking back his terrible sobs. He remembered how he had ordered some chocolate and nougat from the front commissariat. "Don't you dare touch them," he'd said to Vershkov, "or it'll be the end of you." Once again he muttered, "See what you've done to me, my Zinechka, my little one. You might have some pity." He suddenly dragged his suitcase out from under the bed. He took out Xenia's letters and photos, the ones he'd been carrying around for years, the ones she'd sent in her last letter, and the very first cellophane-wrapped passport photo, began tearing them to shreds with his large, powerful fingers. On tiny shreds of paper he recognised words he'd read hundreds of times, words that had made his head spin. He watched her face, her neck, her eyes, her lips, all slowly disappear. He was working as fast as he could. And when it was done, he felt better. He felt as though he had eradicated her, as though he had stamped out the last trace of her, as though he had freed himself from a witch. He had lived without her before. He could get over it. In a year or so he'd be able to walk straight past her without his heart so much as missing a beat. He needed her as much as a drunk needs a cork. But he understood all too quickly how vain these thoughts were. How can you tear something out of your heart? Your heart isn't made of paper, and your life isn't written down in ink. You can't erase the imprint of years. He had allowed her to share in his thoughts, in his work, in his troubles. He had allowed her to witness his strengths and his weaknesses. And the torn-up letters hadn't disappeared. The words he had read hundreds of times were still in his memory. Her eyes were still gazing at him from the photographs. He opened the cupboard door and poured out a large glass of vodka. He drank it down and lit a cigarette. He lit it a second time, though it hadn't gone out. His head was full of clamouring grief. His insides were on fire. "Zinechka, my dearest, my little one, what have you done? What have you done? How could you?" He stuffed the torn shreds of paper back into the suitcase, put the bottle back in the cupboard and thought, well, that's a little better. Soon his tanks would reach the Donbass. He'd visit the village where he'd been born and the spot where his old people had been buried. His father would be proud of his Petya now. His mother would be full of pity for her unfortunate little son. When the war came to an end, he'd go and live with his brother's family. His little niece would say, "Uncle Petya, why are you so quiet?" He suddenly remembered a moment from his childhood. The dog had gone off after a bitch on heat and had come back all chewed up. He had a torn ear, his mouth was crooked, one eye was half closed because of a swelling, and tufts of his long hair had been torn out. He'd stood there by the porch, his tail between his legs. Petya's father had looked at him and said good-naturedly, "So you were just the best man, were you?" Vershkov came in. "Are you having a rest, Colonel?" "Just for a few minutes." He looked at his watch and thought, "All brigades to halt until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, to be transmitted in code." "I'm going to visit the brigades again," he told Vershkov. A fast drive was a welcome distraction. They were going at 80 kilometres an hour on an appalling road. The jeep swayed wildly as it careered over the potholes. The driver kept looking at Novikov pathetically, begging to be allowed to drive more slowly. They reached the headquarters of the 1st Brigade. How everything had changed in only a few hours. How Makarov had changed. It was as though they hadn't seen each other for years. Quite forgetting the usual formalities, Makarov threw up his hands in bewilderment and said, "Comrade Colonel, Getmanov has just transmitted an order direct from Yeremenko. Your own order has been rescinded, and we're to press on with the offensive immediately." 3 weeks later, Novikov's tank corps was withdrawn from the front line and placed in reserve. It was time to overhaul the tanks and bring the brigades up to their full strength. Both men and tanks were exhausted after covering 400 kilometres, fighting all the way. At the same time, Novikov received a summons from Moscow. He was to report to the General Staff and to the Central Administration for senior field ranks. It was uncertain whether or not he would be returning to his command. During his absence, General Noydobnov was to take over the command. A few days before this, Getmanov heard that the Central Committee had decided to retire him from active service. He was to be appointed Secretary of the Obkom in a newly liberated part of the Donbass. This was a post to which the Central Committee attached particular importance. Novikov's summons provoked considerable discussion both at the front headquarters and at the Armoured Forces Administration. Some people made out that it was of no great import that Novikov would soon resume his command. Others argued that it had to do with Novikov's delay at the beginning of the offensive and his unfortunate decision at the very climax of the offensive to call a 10-hour halt in order to rest his men. Still others claimed that it was a result of his failure to establish good relations with his commissar and his chief of staff, both of whom had excellent records. The secretary of the Front Military Soviet, a man who was usually well informed, said it had to do with compromising ties of a personal nature. At one time, he too had thought that Novikov's misfortunes stemmed from his disagreements with his commissar, but this was not the case. He had seen with his own eyes a letter of Getmanov's addressed to the very highest authorities. In this letter, Getmanov protested strongly against Novikov's removal from the command. He said that Novikov was a commanding officer of outstanding abilities and a man who was both morally and politically above reproach. The strangest thing of all was that when he received this summons, Novikov had his first good night's sleep after weeks of painful insomnia. Victor felt as though he were being carried along at great speed by a roaring train. He found it difficult even to remember the quiet of his own house. Time had become quite dense, full of people, events and telephone calls. It already seemed 10 years since Shishakov had called round. He'd been attentive and friendly, full of questions about Victor's health and all kinds of explanations. He had hinted gently that the events of the past weeks were best forgotten. Victor had imagined that the people who had tried to destroy him would now be too ashamed even to look at him. Instead, they greeted him joyfully on his return to the Institute, looking him straight in the eye as they expressed their heartfelt goodwill. The most extraordinary thing of all was that these people were quite sincere. Now they really did wish Victor well. Once again Victor heard his work praised. Malenkov called him for an interview, looked straight at him with his quick black eyes, and talked to him for the best part of an hour. Victor was surprised at how familiar Malenkov was with his work, and how easily he handled technical terms. And if this was surprising, Malenkov's last words were astonishing. "We would be deeply regretful if anything at all were to hinder you in your work. We understand very well that there can be no practice without theory." Victor really hadn't expected that. He found it very strange, on the following day, to see the anxious, questioning look with which Shishakov greeted him, and at the same time remembered the anger and humiliation he had felt when Shishakov had failed to invite him to the meeting held in his house. Markov was warm and friendly, Savostyanov as witty as ever. Gurevitch came into the laboratory and embraced him, saying, "I'm glad to see you, I really am. You must be Benjamin the Fortunate." Yes, Victor was still on the train. He was asked whether he considered it necessary to expand his laboratory into an independent research institute. He was flown to the Urals by special plane, together with the Deputy People's Commissar. He was allocated a special car, which Lyudmila used to go to the store, giving lifts to women who had previously pretended not to recognize her. Everything that had once seemed impossibly complicated and confusing now happened all by itself. Young Landesman was deeply moved. Kovchenko phoned him at home, and within an hour Dubyonovkov had arranged for him to be taken onto the staff at Victor's laboratory. On her return from Kazan, Anna Noibovna Vice-Papier told Victor that all her documentation had been arranged within 2 days, and that Kovchenko had even arranged for a car to meet her at the station in Moscow. Anna Stepanovna had been informed by Dubyonkov in writing that she had been reinstated in her former post, and that the deputy director had decided she should be paid in full for the week she was absent. The new employees were constantly being fed. They said jokingly that their work was simply a matter of letting themselves be ferried all day long from one special canteen to another. Needless to say, this was far from the truth. The new apparatus in Victor's laboratory no longer seemed quite so perfect. He had the feeling that in a year's time it might seem slightly comic, like Stephenson's rocket. What had happened in Victor's life seemed at once both natural and unnatural. His work really was interesting and important. Why shouldn't it be praised? Landesman had a talent for research. Why shouldn't he work in the Institute? Anna Naumovna was indeed irreplaceable. Why should she have to hang around in Kazan? Still, Victor knew very well that but for Stalin's telephone call, his research, for all its excellence, would have been forgotten, and Landesman, for all his talent, would still be unemployed. But then Stalin's telephone call was no accident. It was no mere whim or caprice. Stalin was the embodiment of the state, and the state has no whims or caprices. Victor had been afraid that all his time would be taken up with administrative matters, plans, conferences, taking on new staff, placing orders for new equipment. But the cars he travelled in were fast, the meetings he attended began punctually and moved swiftly to a conclusion, and all his wishes were immediately granted. As a result, Victor was able to spend the entire morning, the time when he did his best work, in perfect freedom in his laboratory. No one disturbed him. He was able to concentrate exclusively on his own interests. His work still belonged to him. It was all a far cry from what happened to the artist in Gogol's The Portrait. He had been even more afraid that other people might encroach on his own field, and this fear also proved groundless. I really am absolutely free, he said to himself in surprise. He thought once of what Artelev had said in Kazan about military factories, how well provided they were with raw materials, energy and machine tools, how free from bureaucratic interference. Yes, thought Victor, it is in its own absence that bureaucracy reveals itself most clearly. Whatever serves the principal aims of the state is rushed along at great speed. Bureaucracy can have two opposite effects. It can halt any movement, or it can speed it up to an incredible degree, as though freeing it from all the constraints of gravity. Not that Victor thought often about those long conversations in that small room in Kazan. He no longer thought of Madryarov as someone remarkably intelligent and altogether exceptional. He no longer felt a constant anxiety over his fate. He was no longer obsessed by the terrible mutual suspicions harboured by him and Karimov. Without his realizing it, everything that had happened to him began to seem quite normal, quite natural. His new life was the rule. He had begun to get used to it. It was his past life that had been the exception, and slowly he began to forget what it had been like. Was there really any truth in those reflections of Artelev's? In the past, Victor had felt nervous and irritated as soon as he crossed the threshold of the personnel department, as soon as he felt Dubyonkov even look at him. In fact, Dubyonkov was very decent and obliging. When he phoned Victor, he said, "Dubyonkov speaking. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Victor Pavlovitch." Victor had always regarded Kovchenko as a sinister and treacherous intriguer who would happily annihilate anyone who stood in his way. He had seemed to come from another world, a world of mysterious unwritten instructions, and to be profoundly indifferent to science itself. In fact, he was not like this at all. He came round to Victor's laboratory every day. He was a true democrat. He didn't stand on his dignity at all. He joked with Anna Noimovna, shook everyone by the hand, and chatted with the technicians and metal workers. It turned out that he had operated a lathe himself in his youth. Shishakov was someone Victor had disliked for years. And then one day he had lunch at his house and discovered that Shishakov was witty, hospitable, a gourmet, and a fine raconteur. He enjoyed good cognac and he collected engravings, and most important of all, he appreciated the importance of Victor's theory. "I've triumphed," thought Victor. But he knew very well that this was not an absolute victory. If the people around him now treated him differently, if they now helped rather than hindered him, it certainly wasn't because he had won their hearts with his great charm, intelligence and talent. Nevertheless, Victor rejoiced. He had triumphed. There were special news bulletins on the radio nearly every evening. The Soviet offensive was still continuing. To Victor it seemed quite natural to link the course of his own life with that of the war, with the victory of the people and the army, the victory of the state. At the same time he knew that it wasn't really quite so simple. He was quite capable of laughing at his childish habit of always wanting to see everything in black and white. Stalin's done this, Stalin's done that, glory to Stalin. He had thought that important administrators and party officials never talked about anything, even with their families, except the ideological purity of their cadres. He had thought they did nothing except sign papers in red pencil, read a short course in the history of the party out loud to their wives, and dream of temporary rulings and obligatory instructions. Now he had unexpectedly discovered that they had a human side too. Ramskov, the secretary of the Institute Party Committee, turned out to be a keen fisherman. Before the war he'd gone on a boating holiday in the Urals, together with his wife and sons. "What more can one ask for, Victor Pavlovitch?" he would say. "You get up at dawn, everything's glittering with dew, and the sand on the bank still cold. Then you cast your lines. The water's black, it's not giving anything away, but it's full of promises. Wait till the war's over, then you can become one of us yourself." Kovchenko once talked to Victor about childhood illnesses. Victor was surprised how much he knew about the different treatments for rickets and tonsillitis. He had 2 children of his own, and had also adopted a little Spanish boy. And this boy was always falling ill, and Kovchenko looked after him himself. Even dry old Svechin talked to him about his collection of cacti and how he managed to save them from the terrible frosts during the winter of 1941. They're not such bad people after all, he thought. I suppose everyone has something human about them. Deep down, of course, Victor understood that nothing had really changed. He was neither a fool nor a cynic. He could think for himself. He remembered a story of Krimov's about an old comrade of his, Bagrianov, a senior investigator in military prosecutor's office. Bagrianov had been arrested in 1937 and then, during the brief spell of liberalism under Beria in 1939, had been released from the camp and allowed to return to Moscow. Krimov had described how one night Bagrianov had turned up on his doorstep. He'd come straight from the station, and his trousers and shirt were in tatters. In his pocket was his certificate of release from the camp. That night Bagrianov had been full of seditious speeches and sympathy for the other prisoners. He had intended to set up as a gardener and a beekeeper, but as he was allowed to return to his former life, his speeches gradually began to change. Krimov had laughed as he described the slow evolution of Bagrianov's ideology. First he was given back his military uniform. At that time his views were still liberal, but he was no longer a raging Danton. Then, in exchange for his certificate of release, he was given a passport allowing him to live in Moscow. And he immediately began to take up the Hegelian position. All that is real is rational. Then he was given back his flat, and began making out that most of the prisoners in the camps really were enemies of the people. Then his medals were returned to him. Finally he was reinstated in the party, without loss of seniority. It was just then that Krimov's own difficulties had begun, and Bagrianov stopped ringing him up. Krimov had met him by chance one day. He had 2 decorations on his tunic collar, and he was getting out of a special car by the entrance to the public prosecutor's office. This was only 8 months after the night when the man in a torn shirt, with a certificate from a labour camp in his pocket, had sat in Krimov's room holding forth about innocent victims and blind violence. I thought then that he was lost to the public prosecutor's office forever, Krimov had said with a wry smile. It wasn't for nothing that Victor remembered this story and recounted it to Nadia and Ludmilla. Nothing had changed in his attitude towards the victims of 1937. He was still as appalled as ever at the cruelty of Stalin. He knew very well that life hadn't changed for other people simply because he was now Fortune's pet instead of her stepson. Nothing would ever bring back to life the victims of collectivization or the people who had been shot in 1937. It made no difference to them whether or not prizes and medals were awarded to a certain Strum, whether he was called to see Malenkov, or was pointedly not invited to a gathering at Shishakov's. And yet something had changed, both in his understanding and in his actual memory of things. Often Victor would make little speeches to his wife. What a lot of nonentities there are everywhere! How afraid people are to defend their honour! How easily they give in! What miserable compromises they make! On one occasion he even attacked Chepitsin. His passion for travelling and mountaineering conceals an unconscious fear of the complexity of life, and his resignation from the Institute reveals a conscious fear of confronting the most important questions of our time. Yes, something was changing him. He could feel it, but he didn't know what it was.